Hi everyone. Sorry, my voice might sound a little rough. Um, the avatar thing isn't really working nicely today, so I just have this scrolling image I'm gonna use, so sorry about that, but you know, what can you do? Sometimes technology doesn't want to cooperate. But yeah, I'm just kind of chilling right now, just watching some videos, so if you want to join me, that's cool. Chatbot's working. Okay, we're good. We're Gucci. Yeah, I don't know, just kind of like a lazy stream, sorta. I can be lazy sometimes, right? Is that allowed? I guess. Yeah, we'll just see what happens.
Shitting me?
No, I don't think so.
You thought it would be some kind of big fucking riot just to pull me out of nowhere? You think I'm some kind of fucking clown?
Maybe.
I ain't doing no fucking charity job.
Again, this is like 4 F words in a row. Marketability, not strong. You'd have to make compromises. Like, this is what's so sad about it. Like, I love what they're trying to do here, and it's so important for like the internet and like new media, but like unfortunately there's a lot of red tape. And like this pilot is something that was created by so many talents and was like thrust into this world by this like big explosion, but like you can't, they don't have infinite money to create the show. That's why this is a pilot, right? That's why this is parentheses pilot, right? It's not like, oh yeah, we have enough money, we're going to create this entire series. You have to make it marketable. That's the unfortunate aspect about this. And like I love what it's trying to do, but like if they're going to be sellable, they have to make some compromises. And if they make compromises at this point, once they've released their pilot, which they have, people are going to notice what the differences are in terms of like what is allowed on like some sort of larger big budget network studio project versus what this is, right? They're going to notice what the differences are, which is unfortunate. Which is, I mean, if the goal is to get picked up by a network or by a studio, then you should probably make it marketable to begin with, in my opinion.
Side of every demon is a lost cause, but we'll dress them up for now with just a smile.
Again, I almost made the music for this show. I was talking to Vivsi, and she was asking about, you know, getting music for like a project she was working on. I said I was too busy. And as much as, you know, I would have loved to be a part of this, I feel like it's more appropriate that I didn't do it because I would have created something entirely different for this. I would have created something completely different, and I think that this suits it so much more for what it's going for, honestly.
Your plan is sound.
My music is like way too personal. Like if I'm gonna make music for like a musical, it's gonna be like depressing as shit. You know? It's gonna be weird. I'm so evil.
Now.
Stay tuned.
That was cool. That was cool. Vivian, great job. You should be proud of that, honestly. Like for an independent project, really. Like honestly, that's super super fucking cool. Yeah. So like really, I mean like this is something that can trick people into, people joining the stream thinking like, oh yeah, this is like some sort of network television show, right? Like it's a huge accomplishment. You should obviously be proud of this.
Once formed, the army was split in half by age, with the older half of each class acting as the home guard, defending Rome itself from attack. The younger half formed the field army and campaigned on enemy territory. This first legion numbered around
I
5,000 to
don't
6,000
know what to
men,
do, so
and
I'm just
fluctuated in
watching
size
videos.
depending on the needs and available resources.
I
of a
hope that's
particular
okay.
campaign. During the 4th century BC, Rome greatly expanded its potential pool of manpower as the city grew, and as it granted limited citizenship to many of those in newly conquered territory, particularly to the nearby Latin tribes they defeated. This allowed Rome to increase the number of levied field legions from 1 to 4. Legions were also standardized in size to 4,200 infantry, with 300 cavalry attached. After a series of 3 wars with the Samnite Confederation of hill tribes, Rome became the master of central Italy. On the Roman road to glory and victory in the 4th century BC, the Romans also experienced humiliation and defeat. In 390 BC, a marauding Gallic warband defeated the Romans and then proceeded to sack Rome itself. The Romans were also decisively defeated by the Samnites. They ritually shamed an entire surrendering Roman army after the Battle of the Caudine Forks. These devastating setbacks brought out Rome's best quality, adaptation, which was manifested by a willingness to adopt elements of their enemies' arms, armor, and tactics. Rome fundamentally changed the structure, organization, and tactics of its army during the 4th century BC. Exactly when is a matter of scholarly debate. The Greek-style phalanx at the vanguard of the army was abandoned. It had proved to be especially vulnerable when deployed on the uneven hilly terrain of central Italy. It is generally believed that the manipular formation which replaced the phalanx was copied from, or inspired by, a similar Samnite system. The maniple was a tactically flexible unit typically consisting of 120 men. A brief transitional iteration of the legion was used, which shuffled around the classes in the battle order and introduced the manipular system. The following reorganized legion, which was used for 2 centuries, with minor adjustments.
I think it's kind of funny, like when I have my thing scrolling like this, it's like, trust no one, not even yourself.
Like their predecessors, the manipular legionaries were levied from eligible property-owning citizens, obliged to purchase their own arms and armor. However, they were not only motivated by patriotic duty, but were semi-professional soldiers that were monetarily compensated for their time out on campaign. Like the former systems, infantry units were initially arranged on the battlefield according to their wealth. Prior roles were reversed from earlier times, with the wealthiest of the 3 heavy infantry classes, the triarii, deployed in the rear. The next most affluent, the principes, were in the center, and the less well-off hastati in the vanguard. The first-line infantrymen, the hastati, meaning spearmen, derived their name from the Roman word for spear, hasta. They did not carry a spear, but were likely reorganized from earlier units that did carry a spear, and kept the name while losing the spear, replacing it with a pair of heavy javelins called pila. Like the later Imperial Roman legionary, the hastati was a swordsman.
Oh, hello, we have some new people joining us in the stream.
In
Hello.
early Republican times, the Greek Xiphos short sword was most commonly used, until it was abandoned in favor of the gladius hispaniensis. The Romans encountered the blade during their wars with Carthage, as it was commonly used by Iberian mercenaries during the conflict. They were impressed by its superior thrusting capability and tendency to cause grievous wounds. So, they adopted it. Along with the implementation of the manipular system, the scutum, a large curved oval shield, was introduced. The scutum incorporated design and construction elements from
That sounds
the
way
flat
too
oval
close to
Gallic shield
scrotum.
and earlier Italian shields. It was made of 3 layers of wood glued together, which was covered in canvas and leather. This heavy shield weighed about 10 kilos. With its prominent boss and metal rim, it was also used as an offensive weapon, as well as a defensive protection. It dealt a formidable punch which could off-balance an enemy, or break a leg or foot with a well-placed blow. Initially, hastati were selected solely based on their wealth. However, as time went on, their delineation was determined based on a combination of their age and experience. Consequently, Hastati tended to be younger men, from their late teens through mid-20s, energetic, with minimal experience, and eager for a fight. The middle line of heavy infantry, the Principes, were typically family men considered to be in the prime of life. Most of them would have been in their late 20s to mid-30s. The Principes were more heavily armored compared to the Hastati, who was usually equipped with a simple pectoral plate which protected his heart and other vital organs. This form of armor was cheap and effective, and depending on the soldier's budget, it was either made of copper, brass, bronze, or iron. The Principes were generally able to afford an expensive Greek-style muscle cuirass, or a chainmail coat. Chainmail was invented by the Celtic Gauls, and was worn by their chieftains and elite warriors. Ever since the Gauls had sacked Rome in 390 BC, the Romans hated and despised them. They described the Gauls as primitive and brutish barbarians. However, they were not above stealing a good idea. The Romans wholeheartedly adopted chainmail
I
and
hate
improved its
Gauls.
design.
My
and
father
manufacturing
hated
techniques,
Gauls,
eventually
and I
thus
hate
producing it for
Gauls
thousands
just
of
as
soldiers.
much.
For almost all of the Roman Empire's very long history,
Mega Flame
chainmail
RP,
was the most
howdy.
common armor
Howdy
used by
to
Roman
you,
infantry.
Mega Flame RP.
Principes also commonly wore higher quality helmets compared to the Hastati, like the popular Italo-Corinthian helmet. Both the Principes and Hastati wore a single greave on the left leg. The reason for this was the legionary stance while fighting with the gladius. While defending or striking, the left foot was forward and the right back further away from the enemy. Consequently, the extra weight and expense of a greave worn on the right leg was viewed as unnecessary, and the one greave look may have become quite fashionable for a time. The third line of heavy infantry, the Triarii, were initially just the old first-class hoplites moved to the rear of the battle order and reduced in size. Sometime around the early 3rd century BC, the Triarii adopted the scutum. The Triarii also adopted the gladius hispaniensis as a backup weapon, while remaining first a spearman, sticking to their hoplite roots. Other than that, the Triarii were armed in a similar fashion to the Hastati and Principes, although usually with better quality weapons. Like the other heavy infantry, the Triarii were also first selected based on property class. This transitioned to selection based on age and battlefield experience, but they still tended to be wealthier. The typical age in a Triarii mana pool was from the mid-30s to late 40s. In
GT
contrast to these
Alex?
grizzled veterans,
GTA
the
Lex?
were the youngest and least
I guess there's two ways you could
experienced
say
members
that.
of the Legion,
Thank you for
still meeting the minimum
following.
property
I keep saying
requirement for
subscribe.
service. The
I'm too used to
Weletis
that
were lightly
YouTube thing.
equipped, armored only with a helmet and a light shield. They also usually wore animal skins over their helmets. This allowed them to quickly identify each other during battle, added an additional layer of padding to protect the cranium, and it probably just looked cool. Or
People who
intimidating.
have
To see
played
1,000+
Fallout New
man
Vegas,
wolf
this
pack
might be kind of
prowling the enemy,
informative.
harassing them,
Explains
and
why a
testing
lot
their
of the
weak spots. They carried up to 7 light javelins.
Caesar's
During a battle,
legions dress the way
after
they do.
Weletis had
They're kind of
potentially thrown
emulating a lot of
thousands
this.
javelins at enemy troops, they retreated through the gaps in the maniples to the rear of the army. Weletis were also used to retrieve and transport wounded soldiers to safety during a battle. The most distinctive feature of the Republican Roman legion was the maniple swap. If the first line Hastati failed to break the enemy, after throwing their pila and engaging the enemy in hand-to-hand combat, they withdrew through the gaps in the Principes, who then threw their pila, drew their swords, and charged the enemy a second time. Usually this broke an enemy army. If it did not, the Principes withdrew behind the Triarii. This dire battlefield situation gave rise to the common Roman saying, "So it has come to the Triarii." This phrase being used to describe an intense, desperate, or stressful situation in everyday life. This style of Roman army completed the conquest of Italy and defeated the Empire of Carthage. The Republican Roman manipular system was so successful that it made itself obsolete. As the empire grew, Rome's campaigns were further away, and they took longer to complete, which reduced the morale of its conscripted citizen soldiers. The empire became too large to effectively use a levy system, designed for a city-state to wage summer campaigns against local neighbors. Property owners supplying their own arms and armor was no longer efficient on such a large scale. Most importantly, there was a massive manpower shortage. The minimum property requirement
This guy has a
to serve
voice
in the
that, like,
army was reduced several times,
it's
but that was
partly
still not enough to meet the
really
empire's
relaxing
demand.
and pleasant to listen
In
to, but it
107
almost
BC,
borders on being
the
so
Roman
boring,
general
like
and
it drones
politician
on
Gaius
and you like
Marius
lose
enacted
it.
numerous military reforms. including but not limited to
Oh,
the
that
removal of any
picture
property
there.
requirements for
That's
investment in
called
military. Soldiers were now provided their equipment on the
Quatris
site.
Panis, I think.
Previous classes of
I made that
infantry
the
were
other day. It's
homogenized.
great.
All legionaries were equipped as heavy infantry, with pilum, gladius, and chainmail. Most importantly, legionaries became professional soldiers. As early as the 4th century BC,
is the sound that some poor baker heard that fateful autumn day in 79 AD when Mount Vesuvius blew its top and showered his bakery in hot ash and gas, carbonizing a loaf of bread in the process.
Mount
not
Vesuvius,
exceeding 1800
it
meters.
make a big
Sucks for
boom.
him, but great for us, because today we are going to take a look at that most iconic ancient Roman loaf of bread, the panis quadratus, true Roman bread for true Romans. This time,
Yeah, if you want to
tasting
suggest
history.
anything, let me know. I'm kind of just going through, like, what one thing will lead to another.
So as we saw in the episode a few weeks ago,
So I'll
with
just try and
Athenaeus,
share things
we
that are
have
kind of related
a decent
to it.
number of recipes from
But
ancient
yeah, I
Rome,
followed this
but we don't
guy's
have
bread
one
recipe more or
bread.
less,
What we
and
do know their bread comes from writings about
it turned
bread,
out pretty
not really
good. Like,
recipes,
making
pictures
your
done
own
in
bread
frescoes,
isn't
and then the
that
burnt loaves from
hard. You
Pompeii
just got to
and
kind of
Herculaneum.
understand the
Now, a lot of
basics
people
of
have
it.
recreated this loaf of bread, and I will link to some of those
Oh, Blue
resources in the
Fox, did you
description.
wash your tail
But I'm going to
properly,
take my cue
Kyonkochan?
from London chef Giorgio Locatelli,
I kind
who
of skimped on
recreated
it a
this loaf
bit.
some years
I
back for the British
haven't been
Museum.
able to
And if it's
afford the
good enough for
good
the British Museum, then it's good
high-end
enough for
kitsune
me.
soap
Though
lately.
I've actually made
Sorry.
some changes, so maybe it's not. Anyway, like 90% of breads out there, Chef Locatelli assumes that this is made of flour, water, yeast, and salt. And when I first made it, those are the only ingredients that I ended up using. And it made this lovely, beautiful loaf, but it was rather bland. And so I ended up doing it again. Now that first loaf, I only used whole wheat flour, gorgeous color. This second loaf that I'm doing today looks rather different, but I'm hoping that the flavor is better because I'm adding in some herbs. So for this loaf, you will need 1,000 grams of flour, 250 grams of biga or freshly fed sourdough starter, 3 teaspoons of salt, 400 to 500 milliliters of lukewarm water, and then some dry herbs. I used about a half teaspoon of fennel and a teaspoon of hyssop. Also, the amounts of those ingredients are a little bit variable depending on how loose your starter is. My starter ended up being a little tighter than I usually like, so I ended up using that whole 500 milliliters of water, but you might not need it if you have a loose starter. So the first question you probably have is, what kind of flour do I use? Well, you got options, kid. And for answers, we are going to go to that most prolific of ancient Roman writers, Pliny the Elder. There is no grain that displays a greater avidity than wheat, and none that absorbs a greater quantity of nutriment. With all propriety, I may justly call winter wheat the very choicest of all the varieties of wheat. It is white, destitute of all flavor, and not oppressive to the stomach. Sounds like Pliny would have been a fan of Wonder Bread. Now, Pliny goes into extensive detail about the different wheats of the empire. He talks about their weight, their color, their flavor, yada yada yada. But he saves the top 3 spots for the wheats of Boeotia in modern-day Greece, the Isle of Sicily, and Egypt. Then Pliny talks about flours made from other grains that the majority of the people would have eaten, like barley, rice, spelt, sesame, and the wonderfully named panicium, or African panic grass. Ha! So for this loaf, I ended up using half buckwheat, bad name because it's not a wheat, and half whole wheat. And I'll show you, it really changes the look of the loaf once we're all done. But you can use whatever flours you want. Pliny also has a lot to say about leaveners. He talks about one that's made from millet and must, or the skins of fresh wine grapes, and that is where the yeast would come from.
GTA Alex. One of my favorite topics that I studied was grave robbing in Scotland in the
Gaul and Spain, where they
1800s.
make a drink by steeping corn, they employ the foam which thickens on the surface as a leaven.
A cute
Hence it
seal.
the
Is that
in those
bread?
countries
Heck
is
yeah, it's
lighter
bread.
than that made elsewhere. And just a note, by corn, he means grain, not like American corn. And then there's the kind that I'm going to use, which is just regular old sourdough which pulls its yeast from the air. Good old California air yeast. Not sure why that's southern, but whatever. So first, take your water, lukewarm or room temperature is fine, and stir in your salt. Then mix your herbs into the flour. Then take your flour and dump it out onto a flat surface and create a ring, or what's called a fontaine. Then, in the words of Johnny Cash, pour that yeast in that burning ring of flour, and start to work the flour into the sourdough starter with one hand while you pour the
Ouch.
salt water slowly with the other. Then just keep mixing as the dough comes together.
That
Now,
joke
like I
was
said,
so
you might
forced,
not
I think
need
it's going
all
to
of
press
that,
charges.
water, so just kind of keep an eye on it. Once it comes together, stop adding water. If it's actually too wet, then just throw some more flour in there and you're good to go. Then go ahead and knead your dough. I kneaded it by hand. It took about 15 minutes to get kind of a nice smooth dough. But if you have a bread maker, you can go ahead and use that. I wouldn't use a stand mixer because this is a lot of heavy dough and you might burn out that motor. But if you do have a bread mixer, no shame in using it, especially because then you'll have a free hand to tap that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss another episode of Tasting History, which would be a disaster. Not Pompeii and Vesuvius, but a close second. Now once your dough is kneaded to perfection, place it in a bowl, cover it, and let it rise for 90 minutes to 2 hours, or until it about doubles in size. So now a lot of classical writers wrote about bread and wheat and all of these ingredients, so let's take a look at why relying on Pliny the Elder is so
Oh my gosh, I
apropos
think he has the
for this
Bayo
bread.
tapestry on his apron. That's great. That's a pretty good choice for an apron.
Gaius Plinius Secundus, aka Pliny the Elder, best known as an author and philosopher, but
AKA
overachiever
Pliny
that he
the
was,
Boomer.
happened to also be the admiral of the imperial fleet moored at Misenum north of Naples on that fateful day in 79 AD. Sadly, his nephew, Pliny the Younger, not incredibly creative with names, this family, he was the only person to give an eyewitness account of the disaster, a blow-by-blow of the eruption. And he gives us some insight into just how his uncle died. Here's where the story picks up just after the eruption. My uncle's scholarly acumen saw at once that it was important enough for a closer inspection, and he ordered a boat to be made ready, telling me I could come with him if I wished. I replied that I preferred to go on with my studies. A chance to check out a massive black, unnatural, looming cloud coming over the horizon, and this kid decides that he's going to stay home and do homework. I mean, I know I'm not one to talk, but nerd alert. He tells how his uncle took several ships to go to Stabiae to check on a friend. And it's a little odd because clearly he was worried about his friend enough to go down there, but then when he got there, they packed up some stuff, put it on the ship, and then returned to his friend's villa for dinner, while they watched broad sheets of fire and leaping flames from Mount Vesuvius. My uncle tried to allay the fears of his
You know
companions
what?
by repeatedly
There's actually a
declaring that
manga
these
based
were
on this
nothing
I
but
was reading. It's really
bonfires
good.
loved by the peasants in their terror. You should have terror too, Pliny. You should have terror. But clearly he did not, because after dinner, he went and took a nap. Finally, some hours later, and only because the courtyard had gotten so filled up with pumice and ash that they were in danger of being trapped inside.
Let me find it here. I'll show you guys. Yeah, there it is. Plinius. It's a good read. It stars Nero, too. Everybody's favorite Fate character. Nero is best waifu. Poppaea. But yeah, go check it out if you get a chance. It's Plinius by... Where's the guy's name? Or girl's name? Oh, so it's by Mari Yamazaki. But yeah, check it out. Really good.
Did they decide to hoof it, with pillows strapped to their heads to ward off falling objects. So when they eventually get to the ships, Pliny realizes that due to the earthquakes caused by the volcano, the waves are way too high and they're trapped. So he sits down on the beach and takes a rest. Then the flames and smell of sulfur, which gave warning of the approach of fire, drove the others to take flight and roused him to stand up. He stood, leaning on 2 slaves, and then suddenly collapsed. When daylight returned on the 26th, 2 days later, his body was found intact and uninjured, still fully clothed, and looking more like sleep than death. And that's how most people died that day. It wasn't lava, it was noxious gas and falling ash. And that's kind of lucky for us, because instead of being completely flattened, Pompeii and Herculaneum are wonderfully preserved, including their bakeries. One such bakery, or Pistrinum, is that of Popedius Priscus. He had his own mill with 4 giant millstones made of basalt lava. Foreshadow much? They were likely driven by donkeys to grind the grain into flour. Then in a separate room, the dough was mixed using huge mechanical paddles. So if you are using a bread machine to make this, that's okay, because they didn't do it by hand either. Popedius approves. In fact, it seems that the only part of the process that was done by hand was the actual shaping of the loaves. And so that's what we're going to do right now. So set your oven to 400 degrees Fahrenheit or 205 degrees Celsius and turn your dough out onto a lightly floured surface. Then knock out the air. Then shape it into a ball and set it on either a baking sheet or a bread cloche like the one that I used. And if you are using a bread cloche, be careful because they're delicate. I broke mine today. I'm very sad about it.
Aww.
Then pat the loaf
Bread
down in a sort of a
cloche.
flat-topped cake and cover it and let it rise for another 20 minutes or so. Once your second rise is done, we're going to go ahead and
Why
give
am I
this
just
loaf
now
its
noticing that
iconic shape.
magmar in the
So take a
background?
piece of baking string and tie it right around the middle of the loaf and
Am I
cinch
slow?
it so it looks like
Am
my
I a
waist
slowpoke?
in pants that I haven't worn since before quarantine. Now for the lines on top, there's a lot of debate, but there's debate on everything to do with this loaf pretty much, so using Occam's razor, I'm going to go with the simplest explanation and use the string that we've already got to make 4 deep impressions on the top, which creates 8 separate sections. Then stick your finger in the middle of the loaf to make an indentation to keep the bread from cracking, and slide the bread into the oven for about 40 to 45 minutes. If you are using a cloche, remove the lid about 30 minutes into baking so it can darken up a little bit. Now my loaf did not need to darken because I used that dark buckwheat. So honestly, it kind of looks like the burnt loaf from Herculaneum, but it smells fantastic as it's baking. So once the loaf is done, remove it from the oven and set it on a cooling rack to cool. So here we are, our panis quadratus, or Roman loaf of bread, and you can see the vast difference between just using
I mean,
2
that's kind
different
of human
types of
history in a
flour.
nutshell,
So,
really, is
you know, use
millions
what
of
you
people
want,
died
but
for
just know
bread.
that some are going to look more pleasing than others.
Except for those places where I guess they eat
If
rice.
you're doing this for
They
pictures,
died for
I'd go
rice
with the lighter
instead.
flour. It's prettier, but this other one, the darker one, smells a lot better than the other did. So let's cut into this. It is definitely dense, but you kind of knew that by the shape. So let's take a little bite here.
Damn, that's a
I
thick
don't like
loaf.
the color.
That loaf
I gotta
thick.
say, smells good, but I don't like the color. All right. So it's definitely better than the previous loaf that I had tried, but still not great. Current Italians do it better, I think. But then again, we don't actually know, because all that we've got to go on are the looks of the bread and some of what Pliny tells us. But that's how it goes, you know? Sometimes you win and sometimes you don't. If you're interested in other ancient Roman recipes,
Oh, where
I
did
have a
everyone
playlist
go?
down
We had like
here
a
of
bunch
all
of
the Roman
people in here
recipes
and
that
they
I've done
just
so far
left.
on the show, so I will see you next time
Huh.
on Tasting
That's
History.
unfortunate.
Have you had a long day of fighting and besieging the ancient city of Troy?
Uh-huh.
Looking for that little pick-me-up halfway through your 10-year journey home to Ithaca?
Sure am.
Well, then have I got the brew for you.
Oh, the bread
Kikion,
looks pretty good,
Drink
Cagliostro.
of Heroes. Throughout ancient Greek myths and histories, Kikion pops up time and time again. So today I'm going to use the Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer to try to recreate this legendary potion as best I can. This time on Tasting History. The drink kykeon crops up in ancient Greek sources over and over again. But what exactly was it? There is no recipe per se, and several of the sources have conflicting descriptions, but at least in the Iliad and the Odyssey, we get a list of the ingredients. In the Iliad, the Greek warrior Machaon is badly wounded by the Trojan Paris, and King Nestor takes Machaon back to his tent so that his captive servant Hecamede can take care of him and nurse him back to health. Fair-haired Hecamede made a potion for them. First, she moved a table up to them, a fine, polished table with a dark, gleaming stand. On it, she placed a bronze dish with an onion in it as relish to the drink, and also yellow honey. Next came the heap of holy barley meal. Thus, in a cup, the lovely woman made a kykeon for them with Pramnian wine. She grated goat's cheese into it with a bronze grater and sprinkled white barley meal on it, and she bade them drink when she had made ready the potion. And it seems to have done its work because in the next verse, they're both up on their feet, like laughing and having a great time. Yay, kykeon. That is definitely a better outcome than what happens after someone drinks kykeon in the Odyssey. After escaping the Cyclops and almost being eaten on an island of giants, Odysseus and his crew, with only one ship left, find themselves the guests of the beautiful sorceress Circe. She brought them in and made them sit on chairs and seats, and made for them a potion of cheese and barley meal and yellow honey with Pramnian wine. But in the food she mixed baneful drugs that they might utterly forget their native land. Now when she had given them the potion and they had drunk it off, then she presently smote them with her wand and penned them in the styes. Spoiler alert, she turned them into pigs. Well, all but Odysseus, who had really great plot armor throughout the Odyssey. So with the exception of a side of onion in the Iliad and baneful drugs in the Odyssey, we have all of the ingredients for our kykeon: barley meal, honey, goat cheese, and Pramnian wine. Now as for the consistency, we get clues from the name. Kykeon comes from the verb kykeo, which means to churn or mix, with the connotation of until thickened. And that makes sense because in his writings on Homeric hymns, the 12th century Archbishop Eustathius of Thessaloniki, try saying that 5 times fast, because even 1 time slow is rather hard. But he said that kykeon is not quite food, not quite drink, but something like a drinkable soup. And that means that we're going to have to add some heat into this recipe, which Homer does not mention, but, you know, Homer wasn't a chef, so I'll give him poetic license. So for your kykeon, you will need a half cup or about 100 grams of barley ground into a meal, 1 cup or more of dry red wine. Don't worry, I'll explain the or more later. 1/3 cup or 50 grams of goat cheese, and 2 tablespoons of honey. So first things first, you're not going to need your entire bottle of wine, so go ahead and pour your glass while you cook. La 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 la. Cheers. Now add your cup of wine into a small saucepan, and then stir in your barley meal, the goat cheese, and the honey. Mix everything together as best you can, then set it over low heat and stirring continuously, bring it to a simmer. Once it starts to thicken a bit after about 3 minutes, take it off the heat. And then you just pour it into a glass and wait for it to cool down to a drinkable temperature. Now, if it's thickened up a little too much, this is the time that you will add that extra red wine just until it's a consistency that you feel like you're going to want to drink. So while my kykeon cools, let us look at where this most interesting of concoctions came from. And for that, we must travel back to the time of the gods. Yeah, ancient Greece. Most everything in ancient Greece had something to do with the gods, and kykeon is no exception. And like I said, the ingredients vary a little bit depending on the source, but there are always 2 constants: the barley and the wine, both of which have strong ties to the gods. For the barley, we must look no further than the goddess of the harvest, Demeter, who was often depicted with a laurel of barley or else with poppies, which grow in fields of barley. Some ancient Greek and Roman coins depict her head on one side and a stalk of barley on the other. And it makes sense that Demeter is associated with this drink because not only was she the goddess of the harvest, but she also presided over the cycle of life and death. And as we saw in the Iliad, Machaon was likely mortally wounded, but very badly wounded. He could have died, and just a sip of this Kyonkochan brings him back to health. You're not going to get back to health without a little help from Demeter and her barley. The drink was also a key component.
So it's basically
of the
like
Eleusinian
ancient Greek
mysteries,
senzu beans.
ancient initiation rites for the cult of Demeter and Persephone held at the sanctuary of Eleusis. If you've ever played Assassin's Creed Odyssey, you can actually go visit the sanctuary in the game, which is kind of cool to like see it, as an artist's rendering and walk around. Part of the ceremony took place in a great hall called the Telesterion, and revealing anything that had to do with the Telesterion was punishable by death. And it's likely during this part of the ritual where the initiates would fast and then drink Kyonkochan, which would cause them to have visions of the gods. Now, those visions could have been caused by getting drunk on an empty stomach, but more than likely, it was because they added extra hallucinogens to the drink, or it was caused by ergot, which is a fungus that grows on barley and some other grains that can cause hallucinations. So now, if the penalty for revealing anything about these rites is death, then how do we know anything about them? And for that, we have to thank those bad boys of ancient Greece, the playwrights. First, we have Diagoras of Melos, who revealed many of the secrets in some of his poems, and according to Cicero, was killed for doing so. Then there's the great playwright Aeschylus, who was actually put on trial for revealing too much of the secrets of the rites in his plays. Lucky for us and for him, he was acquitted, possibly because he had a god on his side, the god of the theater. And it would make sense because it's that god that gave us our second ingredient, wine. Dionysus, god of theater, fertility, and wine. And hands down, the coolest god of the bunch. Now, the wine that's mentioned by Homer is Pramnian wine. So this wine is a special wine from ancient Greece that has quite the close connection with Dionysus himself. According to the writer Athenaeus, the wine originated on Mount Pramnos on the Isle of Icaria, a stronghold for the cult of Dionysus.
Hi, Andy.
And the inhabitants of the island claimed that the vine where the grapes grew to make this wine had been given to them from Dionysus himself. And to this day, they
And I'm glad to know I'm not your favorite trap VTuber.
Called Focciano. Now, we don't know that that is the grape that was used to make
Focciano?
but it could be.
Huh? You trying to go on Focciano with me?
The wine that they make there today is nothing like Pramnian wine of ancient Greece, and that's probably for the best. Because it was described as black wine which should never be drunk without watering it down first. And both Hippocrates and Galen said that it should be reserved for its therapeutic qualities. Archbishop Eustathius, here's that name again, said, "The Pramnian, as they say, is fat and strengthening, and it's not suitable for quenching thirst, but rather for alleviating satiety." So if you ate too much and you're a little bloated, that's the time to reach.
I hate Kyonko. I prefer British
Basically the
Kyonko.
ancient Greek Pepto-Bismol. The Greek grammarian Hesychius hedged his bets when describing the wine.
Well, that is too bad because I do not like the British Kyonko. I am going to be the French Kyonko now. Ce sera comment ça va. If you don't like it, then you can go merde.
Fragrant wine, ripe and flavored like nectar.
I'm gonna hate listening back to that later and hearing my terrible French thing in the
My two
stream.
favorite allusions to Pramnian wine come
Oh, I just do
something the
things
Greeks
I
really
regret
excelled at.
sometimes.
Ephippus of Olympus, most famous for his chronicles of Alexander the Great, sang, "Oh, how luscious,
It wasn't
oh, how
that
fine
great.
is the Pramnian lesbian wine."
Hey, if
All
Alexander the
who are
Great
all who
was
are
so
wise
great, how come he
must
couldn't
go
conquer
on to the
India,
Lesbos
huh?
surprise. Sounds like one of those songs in the Lord of the Rings books that people just always skip over.
Kind of makes an
All that.
interesting point, actually,
Also, the
that
term lesbian here does not refer to
like,
the modern
Alexander the Great
lesbian,
considered
but
India
as
a
coming
formidable
from the
enemy
Isle of
because he
Melos,
wanted to
which
conquer it.
the
So it's
modern
like
lesbian actually
validation even back then
Etymology
for the
is
Indian
full.
continent by the
Finally,
West
there's
of
the
like,
great comedic
man, these guys are
playwright
serious.
Aristophanes. Shun my boy the Pramnian cup,
There it is,
nor
it's-
Thasian drink, nor Chion sup, nor let
Andy
your glass
McGuffin,
with
hey, you
Epiphany
still have one of them
writing, for
Discord
bachelors, that
invites.
liquor's
Yeah, one
too
second.
exciting. The Greeks are just so cool. Anyway, we don't actually know what Pramnian wine tasted like, so I'm doing my best by getting a dark, dry, red Greek wine. a dark, dry, red Greek wine that I added barley to, and cheese, and honey, and should be about ready to drink by now. I'm a little scared.
Cheesy
Okay,
wine,
Here we
honey?
go. Kyonkochan. Now, you'll notice I do not have a glass like they mention in the Iliad, which is big and ornate and has handles and is supposed to be so heavy that when full, no man could lift it. I have
What a
instead what I
sissy!
think is probably meant for margaritas. But it will just
Eh,
have to
margarita,
do,
you know, pretty close approximation to historical
here we
Greek
go.
drink.
To being a hero, I guess. A Greek hero. Smells like
Zero
wine.
to hero in no time flat. Zero to hero. I think he likes it.
It's very, very thick. It's
As a
it
thick
tastes
drink.
Like wine with. I mean, it tastes like what you'd think it would, which isn't good because it's wine with barley and cheese and honey and.
It's like the entire
barley.
appetizer thing in one.
That's gonna be stuck in my teeth for a while. Yeah, I cannot, in good conscience.
Somewhere along the way, like some
have
ancient
anyone
Greek
else
writer
make
just
this-
decided to prank everyone
this.
and
I mean, if you want to, go
made the
ahead,
recipe
but
absolutely
I'm not
terrible.
going to
And
endorse
he's like, shit, people actually
Kyonkochan at
believed
all.
me.
It's really interesting. Even if you didn't cook it, I think it would have the same flavor. It would just be even more like just things floating in it. This at least it kind of reminds me of like boba tea, which I don't really like.
Boba tea.
Because the barley pieces just like, and I don't. Maybe it's also some of the cheese isn't like completely melted. I don't know. It's not.
It's like a poutine shake.
I can see why maybe it lost favor after the heroic age because you have to be a hero to drink this. Kyonkochan. I'm gonna take another. That wine is really dry. That wine is really dry.
Asahi,
Oh, and I can taste the
super
cheese in that one.
dry.
That's weird. That's not good. That's not good at all.
It's
Wow.
no bueno.
Yeah, I'm glad that I did this. I'm glad that I did this and saw, what it could be.
It's
There
no
are different
bueno.
versions,
It's
written
muy
about, but
picante.
This is essentially going to be what it is.
Senor, I do not like
And
it.
it's not good.
Take
not
it
good.
away.
But
You are
that's
killing
what it's all
me.
about, right? Tasting history. So that's the name of the show. He said the name of the show, Mom. Anyway, yeah, like this video, subscribe, and I will see you next time on Tasting History.
What is tasting history, though? Boom. Oh, I love this guy's
Have
videos.
you ever thought about light and where it goes? Don't worry, there's nothing wrong with your device. I'm standing in the middle of a country road with no illumination at night, and thus, there's nothing to see.
Or no, we should
Well,
probably
that's
stick to
not
history
quite true,
videos.
but there's not enough.
Greetings all. After completing something of a fire hose of a course for the army last week, I haven't had a heck of a lot of time to do editing for anything particularly heavy. However, I have been inspired a little bit by a post recently by Steve Zaloga over on the Book of Faces, in which he admitted he had
Book
a
of
secret
Faces?
forbidden love. There are a number of candidates out there for worst
I call it
prank
Stalker
ever.
Book.
Some would say mouse. Others, who are apparently willing to risk their lives for saying so,
You hear that,
might say
Facebook?
Bob Semple.
I'm looking for sponsors.
A very common answer would be the
You
Valiant.
bastards.
And indeed, it was #1 on David Fletcher's list of worst tanks ever, and from the short test report that I've read, I can see why. Now, that said, Ed over on the Armored Archives channel makes an argument that it wasn't actually as bad as all that. Not sure I agree with him, but watch his video, come to your own conclusions. Covenanter also has claim to the title, but again, there is a bit of recent research indicating that by the time it left service, much of the trouble had been fixed. However, all these tanks are, comparatively speaking, fairly well known. The following ones, however, not so much. The vehicles in question are the Dutch Order Marmon Harrington tanks. Stephen described the Aberdeen report he read as vituperative, which sent me to the dictionary. However, I had a suspicion as to the meaning, given that I happen to have come across copies of the Aberdeen test reports of the vehicles in my own archive digging, and they are some of the most scathing reports I've ever encountered from anywhere. Now, it could perhaps have been that since these were not ordnance designs, the ordnance personnel doing the testing may have felt more free to let rip, but that doesn't necessarily make the report inaccurate. And in fairness, they did seem willing enough to point out failures in ordnance equipment as well. So, as a birthday present to Steve, I give this report on the CTMS and MTLS tanks. Now, I have no idea when.
Oh my goodness. Those are just like blocks.
So as I'm going through this, please bear in mind that these are production standard vehicles built to fight in line units. These are not prototypes which you would expect would have bugs that need to be identified, worked out, and refined. There is going to be a lot of reading here. Now, ordinarily I don't go for all that much outside of what I normally do, but I think in this case it's necessary in order to get the full effect. So settle back comfortably and listen to the dulcet tones of my voice as you drift off to sleep. Anyway, Marmon Harrington are an American company at the time out of Indianapolis, which had a bit of a sideline in armored vehicles. As far as tanks were concerned, their efforts before the American
Wait, are you serious, Andy?
left something to be desired.
Was the channel?
They did try building some light
My
tanks
Discord
for the
wasn't
Marine
taken
Corps.
down, was it?
Didn't really work out too well.
Oh, okay.
In the meantime, though, they did have the tank manufacturing capability to spare, and some countries weren't really all that picky. China ordered 200.
Wait, why did you leave the chat, Andy?
40AC light tanks for its ongoing dispute with the Japanese. However, there was a dispute
Was it
on
just
the
not
exact
your groove?
capability of the vehicles to be provided, and China refused to accept delivery. They were accepted into service on an emergency basis with the US Army as the light tank T-16.
It looks like a big plastic model, yeah. It's pretty chunky.
By something better, which would prove to be basically almost.
It almost looks like something you'd see in Warhammer. It just has that like chunky design.
At least T-16 was accepted for service.
Like something the orcs would put together.
For the next Marmon Harrington production, the CTMS-1 TBI.
Thick tank.
It's to be noted, by the way, the documentation refers to them as CTMS ITBI as well. They are, however, commonly referred to as the three-man Dutch tank, to distinguish it from the four-man Dutch tank.
Three-man Dutch tank. I don't know why, that sounds funny.
These were produced for the Dutch East Indies Army on an emergency basis because the preferred tank supplier, the UK, was suddenly rather focused on building vehicles for the British Army instead. However, since the Dutch East Indies failed to maintain itself as a going concern to receive most of the vehicles, and the US Army looked to doing what they did with the T-16 and using it to fill its ranks, the contract was taken over by the Services of Supply. And then they sent to Colonel Eddy of Aberdeen a letter in December of 1942.
Not a letter.
War Department Office of Chief Ordnance Washington, yada yada, to Director Proving Ground. The Marmon Harrington Company, Indianapolis, Indiana, manufactured a number of three-man and four-man tanks for the Dutch government. Due to the inability of the Dutch to utilize these vehicles, they've been taken over by US government. In order to determine the suitability of these vehicles for use by our forces, one vehicle of each type is being shipped to the Proving Ground, attention of Colonel Ix, for test purposes. Colonel Ix, by the way, if you're not familiar with our ordnance, he's the reason that we have a lot of this material that was kept. Upon receipt of these vehicles at the Proving Ground, it is requested that they be tested under such features of the standard test progress as, in your judgment, will determine their suitability for military use by the forces of the United States. The report of the test should show characteristics in relation to any comparable vehicles in our service and include statements as to the relative reliability, accessibility, performance in relation to the nearest standard US vehicle, and so on and so forth. So that sets the stage.
It's kind of jarring to hear
The first
something
vehicle we're gonna
like
talk about
American
is
be that eloquent.
The CTMS, and described neutrally as follows. The three-man Dutch tank model CTMS 1TBI
Them's fancy
is
talks,
fabricated
mister.
from half-inch armor
Round
plate
here
with
we
bolted
just
construction.
talk simple like.
It is very angular in appearance and resembles light tanks, Marine Corps 1937 T3 and M2A2E2. The turret is operated manually and has a traverse of 360 degrees. The armament consists of two caliber 30 machine guns mounted in the bow and a 37mm 44 caliber automatic gun and caliber 30 machine gun coaxially mounted in the turret. Okay, not too bad so far. The suspension is vertical volute spring type, similar to light tank suspensions. The track is steel connected with steel pins without bushings. So
Sounds good, sounds good.
The power plant consists of a standard 4-stroke cycle liquid-cooled 6-cylinder Hercules RXLD gasoline engine.
Hercules engine.
Carburation
Has a cool
and
name.
magnetic ignition system. Powertrain consists of a conventional Type 5-speed transmission, control differential, and final drive unit. Ooh, a control diff, not clutch brake.
Looks like a toy tank you find in a cheap toy, in a cheap soldier toy set.
What it was. I will also tell you that the vehicle massed in at 25,435 pounds, so somewhere just over 12 tons.
Whoa!
And well, basically away they went. The vehicle clocked up 454 miles of operation,
12
mainly
tons
in
in a
March
light
and April
tank?
of 1943. Wow. So your basis for comparison here, the Army's already got M5 light tanks and M4 medium tanks under production. Observations. And I'm not going to read absolutely everything here, but you should get pretty much the gist. The engine is rated at 174 brake horsepower, but the maximum drawbar horsepower obtained with the field dynamometer was 99 dynamic brake horsepower. By the way, excuse the noise in the background. The wife is attending a virtual gender reveal. The cooling of the engine was
Gender
very efficient.
reveal, fuck off!
The drawbar pool.
Who gives a shit what gender your fucking baby is?
And should be approximately 75% of vehicle
I
weight.
hate that shit.
Instead of 29%.
Not for like the
Tractive
whole
resistance was exceptionally
like
high.
being woke,
18-inch or 24-inch
like, oh man, you're forcing gender on a baby thing. It's just like, it's literally just parents celebrating being parents. It's like self-worship of, oh man, we had a kid, aren't we awesome? And its gender is, it's like, your baby isn't even born yet. You're just celebrating yourself. Like,
the vehicle will climb slopes up to
I don't know.
including the 40% slope, which actually
it's like, it's good to have a baby. It's good to, you know, celebrate it, but like,
hard to start and the battery was
man, like, does it need money? Does it need a party?
The main causes for hard starting were faulty ignition, faulty carburation, and a tendency for the engine to jump at timing.
It just sounds so
The gear shift was very hard
fake.
to operate, primarily due to the short leverage of the gear shift lever. The position of first gear is so far from second gear that the vehicle stops before a shift from first to second can be
Unless you do
accomplished.
something cool, like you reveal the gender and
good
it's
news.
like,
Operation in the
if it's
sand
one
was
gender, you plant this
satisfactory.
kind of tree. If it's a different gender, you plant a
Vision
different
from
kind of
any
tree.
position inside the vehicle was greatly limited
Something
by
like that'd be
small
kinda
vision
cool.
apertures, and personnel were
But no,
constantly
it's
trying to
probably
get
just
into a
like
position
color
which would
themed
allow a
stuff
larger
and
field of view. Ventilation inside the vehicle
telling
was very
people
poor,
what
even when
specific
operating with the storage
gendered
hatch open.
things they're going to
Heat
want
radiated
for their
from the
baby
powertrain
when
makes
it's
it
born,
necessary
because
to remove glass
babies
blocks
care
from the
so
vision
much about the
apertures
color
in
of,
warm weather
you know,
operations so as to
what they're going to
secure
throw up
some
on.
air circulation within the
I'm being
vehicle.
crusty
So if
right
you're
now.
running in warm weather,
I'm
you
being
gotta pull
crusty.
the armored vision blocks away.
It's celebrating
Well,
the possibility of giving birth to a dictator.
The following component failures were encountered during test. The ignition system was continually causing trouble due to either a weak spark or change in timing. The magneto had to be adjusted and replaced, and the engine retimed during 360 miles of operation. Due to hard starting characteristics of the engine, the vehicle had to be towed to start numerous times, basically push started, and the battery was discharged twice during the test. Removal of the battery from the engine compartment
Like,
requires
it's a
removal of the
fine
engine
line
exhaust
between
pipe
being
and
critical
carburetor
of,
throttle.
like,
Apart
wasting
from
money and
burnt
stuff on
out during
celebrations and
cross-country
just being
operation
a
after 304 miles.
stick in the mud, not letting other people have fun.
One bogie arm faceplate was broken at odometer 253, and it was discovered that the parts in the bogie arm assemblies are not interchangeable. Basically, you couldn't take a part from one bogie and put it onto another bogie. It was also not possible to order a new faceplate without ordering an entirely new bogie assembly. The vision ports consist of a rectangular casting bolted to the hull and extending inside the vehicle approximately 3 inches. As these sharp angular castings present a hazard to both drivers and assistant drivers' faces, they were covered with sponge rubber from M4 periscope headrests before the start of the test. The tow chain provided with this vehicle broke the first time that it was used. Inspection revealed that the welding of the links was inferior. Steel cable is more satisfactory. The splash trays around the filler tubes of the fuel tanks are a source of trouble as they collect water and allow it to enter the fuel tanks through the filler tubes.
Everything is wrong.
During cold weather, ice forms in the splash trays and has to be chipped loose before you can open the filler caps. The headlight grills are of no value and prevent the cleaning of the headlights after operation of muddy terrain.
No
The
value.
grills should be eliminated to allow cleaning of the headlights and to permit more light to be delivered to the road. The guards
That's
around the
military
headlights do
slang for
provide
piece
sufficient
of
protection against breakage. So your headlights suck, but at least they won't get broken. And I should say that it is basically the best thing that is mentioned in this entire report, is that the headlight guards protect the headlights. Then there is a slew of failures. So when they got it, it had 101 miles on the clock. Shield, cable from battery to generator broken loose, and the bulb instrument panel were burnt out. They got 56 miles before the throttle return spring broke. Spark plug wire ignition wire cracked.
I'm gonna have to send this video to people the next time they start, like, talking about how Soviet tanks were terrible.
Clean the carbs. Starter switch wire had worked loose and needed to be replaced. Then they got another 100 miles, and that's when the bogie arm faceplate fell off. So they
This is great. This is like tragic comedy. It's like
another tank or anything.
poetry in motion.
Chain tow broke. Water and fuel system stopped engine. Well, we saw that coming. Distributor, broken high tension contact on rotor. That's at 300 miles in. Battery had to be replaced at 400 miles. Magneto be replaced at 402 miles. Track shoe had to be replaced at 405 miles. Parking brake burned out at 430 miles. And also there was an oil leak in between the oil filter and the engine block. Magneto adjusted 461 miles. The carburetors had to be adjusted at 461. The battery had to be replaced again at 525. So this is after
Again.
1 month, so that was at 424 miles. Starter failed at 553, or 452 operated. Yeah. Following observations. Failure of one track block and one bogie arm faceplate in all of 304 miles of operation indicate that the suspension would be a major source of trouble. Suspension parts are not interchangeable on the same vehicle or of vehicles of the same type. None of the suspension parts are interchangeable with the existing standard vehicles. The suspension provides a very rough ride, which is hard on the operating personnel and contributes to a jumpy farming platform. The hull, so half an inch of armor again, offers no protection from enemy fire from caliber 50 upwards. The hull and turret are constructed entirely with bolts and nuts. Under combat conditions, this type of construction is hazardous to the operating personnel. You would have thought by the 1940s they'd have figured this out. The entire interior of the vehicle is too cramped and none of the crew members have sufficient space to enable them to function efficiently. The exterior of the vehicle is very angular, with practically all plates presenting a vertical surface to the most probable line of fire. The front particularly is not designed to deflect enemy fire, as it is constructed in 3 almost vertical steps. Maintenance is difficult to perform in this vehicle due to the inaccessibility of the engine and powertrain. The engine is mounted low in the engine compartment and very little space is around it. The powertrain is covered with cowling, which has to be removed, and space inside the vehicle is too limited to permit efficient work. Yeah. Okay, we have concluded that there's not much good to be said about this tank. Now, if you're curious how it actually worked out, the gunner would sit to the left of the gun.
Hi, my name's Johnny, and today we're going to talk about the Ferdinand Tank Destroyer. A very awesome and effective vehicle.
Liar!
No, it's actually a piece of garbage. The story of this vehicle begins in the late 30s, early 40s, when the German army decides that they need a heavier breakthrough tank for its forces. The German army had recently been noticing the shortcomings in its tanks, first when it invaded France and had trouble with heavier tanks such as the Char B, and then especially once they invade Russia and run into the T-34 and KV-1. And the main objective of this new tank was to mount the 88mm L56 high-velocity gun, which was the most effective tank-killing weapon that the Germans had at the time. Both the Henschel and Porsche companies were contracted to make prototypes, and the best one would win and get the contract. And it is from the Porsche prototype that the Ferdinand Tank Destroyer comes from. And oh man, it is quite the story.
Fucking thing sucks!
Now, Ferdinand Porsche was nothing new to the military contract world.
Yeah, like,
He'd been making weapons for the German army.
Porsche could make could make great cars,
He was
but
always
his
fairly
tanks were a
ambitious and trying to
joke.
break new ground with his projects. And he very much kept to this theme with his Tiger bid. Instead of using a single engine design that through a drivetrain went to a transmission that powered the drive sprockets, Porsche decided to think outside of the box and use a petrol-electric generator drive. Now the way this works is you essentially have two gasoline or diesel engines that power two electric generators that then provide power to the drive sprockets at the rear of the vehicle, which then propels the vehicle forward. Now petrol-electric drive was nothing new at this point. It had been used on things like buses, but it had never been used on a very heavy armored fighting vehicle. And this became evident as soon as Porsche started putting his prototype together. He had mountains of problems getting the thing just to work. One of the biggest issues he had was to cram both engines and both generators into the size that the Tiger needed to be. He didn't have significant
It's like,
cooling, and often
in concept, not a bad idea, but practically not
There was also the issue
viable.
that the vehicle was just too heavy and woefully underpowered for what it needed to do, also causing catastrophic breakdowns and engine fires. And although some of these flaws were worked out before the submission, Porsche's prototype failed utterly against Henschel's submission. I mean, it was so bad that the engine failed and caught fire before it could really even start the trials or do anything. And actually, after much digging, I was able to find
It's
some
like,
colorized
the more I
footage
read
of that
into it,
exact
the
event.
more I've discovered. Like,
地面にめり込んだり加熱して炎上したり壊れやすいのが難点ですけどあちゃまたやっちゃった
Now, after this large failure, the German army did the sensible thing and picked the Henschel version, and that eventually became the Tiger
But
tank
yeah,
that we
like,
know and love. And this would be the
I get
end
the
of
impression
Porsche
that
Tiger, and this whole
Germans
disaster
were
has
not
never been heard from again.
particularly
Except there
good
was
at
one
tank
problem.
design in World War
About
II
90
because,
of them. Porsche was
like,
so
their
confident in his
tank
design that he had already
drivers
begun
were really
producing
good, their
hulls
tank
for his
doctrine
tank
was
that
really
didn't
good,
work.
but the actual tanks
And
they
once the Porsche
used
design was turned
were
down,
not as good as
Germany
what a lot of
realized that they had just spent all this money,
what they ran
metal,
up
and
against a
material
lot of times.
creating all these hulls that would never be used. So they had to use them for something.
People often make
I
the argument,
personally
oh,
think
well,
at that point you
Americans
just take
had
the
weaker
loss, melt them
hulls,
down,
but
turn them into
that's
some Stoogs or
okay
something
because
useful, but
you can
this
replace
is
a
what they
weaker
went
hull
with,
tank a lot faster
and
than you
it's
can something with a
really
thicker shell that gets
It was decided that those
destroyed
rejected
anyways.
Tiger prototype hulls would be made into a tank destroyer that would be able to mount the 88mm L70 gun eventually seen on the Tiger II. To do this, a large superstructure for the gun was made that would be welded onto the back of the hull to make room for the additional loader and the large gun that was going to be there. Because of that, they had to take the engines and move them to the front of the vehicle because there wasn't any space for them in the back anymore, and along with this came a few upgrades in armor thickness. In the course of putting all these upgrades on, though, they increased the weight from around 59 tons to a little over 65 tons. Now, this doesn't seem like too much in the realm of super heavy vehicles.
Well, that
but
depends
this
on
thing
how you
failed
read
as the
into
Tiger
them being
prototype
outnumbered,
due to its engines
because
being overstressed by weight already. By adding all
one
that
would
tonnage on, you're just asking
argue,
for more
oh, they were
problems.
outnumbered,
Once it was
so they
all said and done,
performed
about
really
90
well,
Ferdinands had been created,
but more
along
to the
with
point
one
is they were
command tank that
outnumbered
sported the Henschel
because
turret like the original prototype,
from the
and a
beginning,
couple
their
of battery
doctrine
vehicles.
in Russia
The
was
vehicles
just
were assigned to
doomed.
Tank Destroyer Battalions 653 and 654, with 45
So
vehicles in
any
each unit
decent
respectively,
tanks up
and were
against the
shipped off to the
Germans
Eastern
would have
Front to take
done
place in Operation
pretty
Citadel.
decent
Their
damage,
performance, though, was about as you could
but
expect, with many vehicles
the fact that they
destroying
came up
themselves before they
against
could even
tanks
get
that were
into the
not
fight,
only
with
their
issues
equals,
like
but better
gas
in
line
some
fires
cases
and
made it
just
even
engine
worse.
failure. Even once in the field, a lot of mechanical problems plagued the crews, with many tanks having to be destroyed by their crews themselves once they had broken down. There's even a report of several Ferdinands being destroyed from engine failure when trying to climb a hill to get to a firing position.
The Ferdinand could not handle the ascent of the hill. We thought they had got hit by artillery, but after they caught fire, one after the other, We assume that the engines were overheated and exploded.
Dass die Motoren waren, die überhitzt wurden. Die
The
Mannschaft
crews got out and ran away.
alle weggelaufen.
Another issue people often bring up is the fact that it had no self-defense weapon, an MG-34 in the hull or anything like that.
Well, and again, a
Although
lot of
this
that,
was an
the
issue, I
reason
think
they
too much
came
is
up
made out of
against,
this.
like,
You gotta remember
a
that
lot
most
of
German tank destroyers
T-34s
did
is
have a
because that
front-mounted
Russian
machine
tank
gun.
doctrine
The Stug 3, the
emphasized
Hexer, they didn't. And although they
working
had
together
roof-mounted machine
and
guns, these were only
short
supposed to be
range
used in extreme
operations.
emergency type situations. The German doctrine for tank destroyers was to stay behind the line, shoot from
If you want to
afar,
look
while
up
have some of the
something
most
for me,
powerful
check and
guns that the German
see.
army could produce.
I know
think it's only
early
at Kursk where you have
T-34
this
models,
really
I'm pretty sure
weird
didn't have
sort of
radios.
amalgamation of things,
Check and
of
see when they
tanks getting
started
so
to add
close to each
radios
other
to
and infantry being
T-34s.
everywhere and just two lines completely
Because that's a
smashing
big
on top of
reason
each
why
other, that you
German
have the
tanks
issue of
tended
infantry
to
overtaking your
find
tank,
themselves up against
because that didn't
T-34s in
always
that
happen a
way,
lot.
was because
And
they had to
oftentimes won't go very
coordinate
well.
a little more visually, I think.
Now, all that being said, when they weren't broken down and when they were being used in the role they were supposed to be used in, the Ferdinands did pretty well. Battalion 653, after the battle, reported destroying some 320 Soviet tanks and only losing 13 Ferdinands. So, not bad, I guess, but it still doesn't really seem worth it. After the battle, about 50 or so Ferdinands remained. Many complaints about the vehicle's shortcomings were made by their commanders, and in September of 1943, 48 of the remaining 50 vehicles were sent back to the factories to be retrofitted with upgrades. These included a close defense MG-34 mounted in a ball mount in the hull, a commander's cupola taken off the Stug 3, Zimmermann paste applied to most of the vehicle, a frontal armor increase, and the tracks being widened. Now notice, none of the major upgrades are to the engine or power system, and we have once again increased our weight from 65 tons to about 70 tons. And at this point I'm wondering whether Germans didn't just set them on fire themselves. Anyways, there was official name change on May 1st, 1944 from Ferdinand to Elephant to denote the changes between the two, and the vehicles were sent to Italy, a mountainous place. Because why not? In Italy, the vehicles did okay when they could. The terrain isn't really suited for a long-range weapon since you're mostly fighting in the mountains. The breakdowns happen just as often because...
They started adding them in 1940, but only 400 of them got it in the T-34, so yeah. I think early Soviet tank doctrine emphasized group tactics and visual communication.
Now this summary is very
very similar to, like, cavalry, really.
Why would you take this thing that obviously didn't work, invest more time and money into it, just to make it more of a disaster, and waste all kinds of time and resources on it that you do not have? Germany was having all kinds of shortages.
But yeah, I think after they realized Germans were really owning them with their radio communication,
it sort of speaks to the German mentality going towards the war. We're going to make something
they probably
on paper
updated their radios
really great, really
a little
awesome,
more seriously.
Have this big gun, have this big futuristic sort of drivetrain. But in reality, it doesn't work. And instead of just letting it go like any other country would, they just had to keep trying to field it and had to keep trying to make it better. The U.S. Army had a hell of a time.
It's going to work, just give it a chance. It just needs a right war.
To make sure they got it
It's
right.
such a
And
beautiful
you can say
song.
that Germany was in a time crunch, but so was the United States. They were desperately trying to get a heavier tank over to Europe. Going so far as to set up factories and starting production runs for tanks that hadn't gone through
Dragon Tales, Dragon Tales, I'm gonna touch Raiera's Dragon
The Americans could
Tail.
decide when something was bad and then stop using it. The Germans, for some reason, have to just hold on to this thing and make it work when it's just not going to. And it's this kind of mentality that I think would
Touch
ultimately
Dragon Tail.
If anyone else is a huge tank nerd like me, you'll be happy to know there are two of these things left. One pre and one post modification.
Yes, the tail.
The pre-modification Ferdinand
Oh,
is currently at
that
the Kublai
tail.
Tank Museum in Moscow, Russia, and the post-modification example was captured by the Americans in Italy and currently resides in the Tank Museum in England, but lives in Fort Benning, Georgia, and we'll go back there in a few years.
Okay, I'm not actually touching your tail, I'm just figuratively touching your tail.
Hi, my name's Johnny, and I'm not a big fan of anime.
Miss me with that gay shit.
Not for any particular
Ugh,
reason.
anime.
I never
Anime
did.
is the
To be honest,
worst.
I never really tried. But about a year ago, I found something that was so strange I couldn't pass it up. This thing was Girl and Panzer, which, to be put simply, is a high school drama with tanks. And although this sounds like the dumbest thing you have ever heard, and believe me, I did too, it kept true to a lot of the history that surrounds these
It's
World War
so
II vehicles and
stupid,
their
it just
So I got
might
it in on it.
work.
This is the history behind Girl and Panzer.
Bald Daddy Assassin or Gloomy Ass Kicker.
The first episode opens with a flash forward to episode 3, with the Ori team scouting an enemy tankery team in a match. And after making a plan, our main protagonist Miho and her friend Yukuri climb into their tank and begin to move. We are then introduced to the 5 main tanks of the series. First, a Type 89 medium. This Japanese tank was designed in 1928 and used by Japan mostly from 1932 to 1942, and saw action all throughout Asia during its lifetime, from the Battle of Shanghai to Konkan Gol and even the Philippines and Burma. Second, we see a Czech 38T medium tank. Produced in 1938, this Czechoslovakian tank made its name in the German army after the annexation, and served from 1939 to 1945, with many variants being made using its chassis. Third, we have a Sturmgeschütz 3, or Stug 3 for short, an assault gun made out of the chassis of a Panzer III and designed by Germany in 1940.
Oh, you're asking what game you should play.
Model, sporting the 75mm
Well, they
48.
both kill people,
Service in the
so
German army from 1940 to 1945
go with
on
Hitman.
all fronts. Fourth, we have an American M3 Lee medium tank. Designed in 1940, the Lee saw service mostly in North Africa with the Americans, and with the British as the Grant variant. Many also saw service on the Eastern Front under Lend-Lease. Lastly, we see what I would arguably call the true main character of the series, the Panzer IV, or Mark IV as it's called in the show. Designed in the late 1930s by the German Army originally as an infantry support vehicle, this tank over the course of the war became the backbone of the German armored force, and saw service on all fronts in Europe during World War II.
Yeah, as like a point of how enduring
this one is a D
the
model,
Panzer was, they got down to
Now,
Panzer
unfortunately,
model
that is about it as far as tanks go
ABC.
for this episode. But here's what else goes on. Back in the present, after the flash
Yeah, they
forward
got
ends,
down
we
to
meet our
Panzer
protagonist,
J
Miho.
model.
New to the
So
school,
they
she is
gave them
attending
like
Ori High.
letter names, so you'd have
On her
like
first day, she
Panzer
meets 2 friends,
4A,
Sayori and
Panzer
Hana.
4B,
Miho mentions
Panzer
that Sayori's
4C.
birthday is June 22nd, which is the date of the German invasion of Russia, Operation Barbarossa, in 1945.
Just stop. Just stop it.
And that Hana's is December 16th, the same date as Germany's invasion of the Ardennes, codenamed Operation Watch on the Rhine, in 1944.
Man, you know, you could write books on just how wrong Operation Barbarossa was.
Best friends.
Best friends.
Best friends.
Best friends.
After this, we first meet the student council, who inform Miho that the sport of tankery will be resumed at the school, and they quickly pressure her to join.
Does she have a monocle? God, that's scary.
Later that day, the student council interrupts their class for an assembly about electives in the sport of tankery.
Yeah, about that, like,
Now, this is where you
Momo,
really have to begin to suspend your disbelief,
is no one
because to
gonna
sum it up
talk about
quickly,
the monocle
tankery is where high
glass
school girls
thing
fight
that's,
World War II
like,
style
really
tanks for sport,
dumb?
but nobody
No?
dies somehow.
Okay. No. They're okay. I can see their
The
parachutes.
student council does show a video somewhat explaining this, and in it you do catch a glimpse of a British Mark IV, a German A7V, and a French Whippet tank, along with a few shots of Panzer IIIs. Through the assembly, Miho looks
Oh my gosh,
her
her
characters are
eyes.
shown being very interested. Miho, of course, picks a different elective, and her friends, who she just met literally today, are convinced to change their minds and not do tankery to support her because the script calls for it and the show ends. Just kidding. Upon hearing Miho has picked another elective, the student council calls her to the office and threaten her with expulsion if she doesn't join the tank club.
Expel your ass.
How in the hell does that work?
Her friends defend her, but she decides to do it anyways, and the final scene is the first meeting of the tankery team consisting of 5 groups. Our main characters, the student council, the history club, the volleyball team, and a handful of freshmen. They then find the Panzer IV in the garage with Miho saying it can be fixed up. And that's episode 1. The episode begins with the 5 teams looking for more tanks to complete their team. The tanks found are the ones shown in the previous episode, with the 38T found by Miho and the gang while being stalked by and later meeting Yukari, my spirit animal.
It was a mainstay of Field Marshal Rommel's 7th Panzer Division and was an important tank in the initial stages of the Blitzkrieg.
You went kind of crazy there.
Sorry.
The Stug 3 is found by the History Club, the Type 89 is found by the Volleyball Club, and the M3 Lee is found by the freshmen. As the tanks are assembled and the characters discuss and claim them, 2 historical errors are made. First, Monocle Girl refers to the 38T as a light tank, when it was classed as a medium by the German army.
Oh my god!
You fool! The Assault 3 is a wonderful tank. It was able to repel the fierce Russian attacks. Apologize to the Finnish!
Now this line may be wrong because it sounds like she is referring to the Winter War, when the Finns only used Stugs in the Continuation War. Also, from now on, they always call the Stug the Assault 3, which isn't wrong, but it's weird to me. The 5 teams claimed their tanks, deciding on sticking with the ones they found, and this creates a few crew problems. The Panzer IV
Oh yeah, I
currently
play World of
understaffed
Tanks,
with
by
only
the way,
4
if anybody
members,
ever wants to
including
play
5
with me.
a commander, loader, gunner, driver, and radio operator. The 38T is understaffed, needing 4 crew and only having 3,
Here, I'll post,
a commander who also works the gun, a loader, a driver, and a radio operator. And lastly, the M3 Lee, which is the American version of the tank and only has 6 crew when it needs 7. A commander, 2 loaders, 2 gunners, a driver, and a radio operator. If this were the British M3 Grant variant, they would be fine, as the British eliminated the radio operator by creating a bulge in the back of the turret to place the radio by the commander. The Type 89 and the Stug 3 are crewed to full capacity. The teams then fix up their tanks just by washing them somehow, and they await their tankery instructor to come teach them the next day.
Notices bulge.
That night, Miho
Ooh
and the gang
woo.
visit a tank store, something I really wish existed, and we see a few references within. The walls are lined with everything from uniforms to guns to sprockets and road wheels. Also, Yakuri is my spirit animal.
That's not true. That's not true at all. They each have their own personalities, their very own traits, and they change depending on who's operating them.
There's also an A7V like the one seen previously on the TV in the corner, and the Tank Arcade game is utilizing a German tank sight on the screen and the steering wheel of a Tiger 1 as controls. And I also think this game is a reference to the 1980 arcade game Battlezone. They also take a few seconds to BS the way tankery is safe.
It's okay. They use live rounds in matches, but they're used with an emphasis on the participant's safety.
And there is an expedition about the upcoming tankery tournament.
Magical, non-killing, armor-piercing rounds.
The next day, Miho runs into a human.
Oh, phew, we just got hit by that teddy bear shrapnel.
I was forever trapped in an infinite timeline of pain and suffering. I envy death.
Selling guns to high schoolers, LMAO. How? Because it's Japan.
The only modern tank used in the series.
It just goes to show, like, Japan is like so distant from the idea of like using some of these things to like hurt people that they're like,
not giving any advice at all,
we can have fun with tanks. They don't hurt people.
Positions left unoccupied by the teams are the 38T having no loader, the Panzer IV having no radio operator, and the
Oh my
M3
god,
having
so
no loader or
inaccurate.
gunner for the 75mm in the hall. I have no idea where the 6th girl on their team went because they should be able to at least cover the gunner position, but she's nowhere to be seen inside the tank.
Oh man. That's a pretty top-tier background waifu.
Miho also says this.
The tank commander indicates which direction to go with their feet. Feet? Yeah, she kicks the operator in the shoulder in the direction she wants to go.
But this shouldn't apply to the tanks shown. All of the tanks on the team had internal radios for communication. The kick the driver technique was used for tanks where this was not available.
It
Ones
is
I can think of are
Soviet
tanks
technique.
where the fighting compartment and engine were so loud and the commander, who was also the gunner, would kick
Because
the
you
driver
do
in
not
the
have
shoulder
radio
to
and
get
driver get cheeky breaky, you
communicate
must
with the
tippy
loader.
tappy him
Also,
on
he used
shoulder
hand
to teach him
signals
which
to watch
direction to
stealth
go.
The match begins with the Type 89 and Stug 3 teams teaming up on Miho and the gang in a not-so-subtle reference to Japan and Germany's alliance in the Second World War. But nobody can hit anything, so they're fine, and the episode ends with them about to run over Existential Crisis Girl in a field. The episode begins with Existential Crisis Girl cheating death, jumping on the tank, and chilling in the turret. The tank comes to a bridge, and Miho gets out to guide it, even though 5 seconds ago she said that it wasn't safe.
We're all gonna die!
And guides them into a steel cable that breaks right as they get shot in the rear by the Stug, and survive even though in episode 1 Miho said this.
Our armor is weak, so we're out if we get hit head on.
And in reality, that shell at that range should have gone in one end of the tank and out the other.
Well, yeah, the intent was to kill you, Nine.
But as a result, Hana gets knocked out cold and they're...
Dead in the water!
Luckily, Existential Crisis Girl, or Mako, takes over and learns how to drive by reading 3 lines of the manual.
No, I'm not questioning German tank superiority, I'm just stating the fucking obvious.
3 shots, and the M3 Lee is taken out for engine failure.
That felt... kind of good.
Then there's a fan service scene where everybody picks their jobs on the tank.
Someone just discovered, oh...
With the confidence of
Answer!
match against each other under their belts.
What is that? Answer me! What is that? You twinkle-toe maggot shits think you can decorate a tank like that? You apologize immediately, or so help me, I will ram my foot so far upside your interior that we have to dedicate an entire new cavern to the crevice in which I will create in your posterior.
Or St. Gloriana's Girls Academy, where no kidding, Each character is named for a different kind of tea. Also, most of the time that
Yee
they are on
boy.
screen, the song the British Grenadiers plays, and it makes me smile to think that a song that British soldiers marched to in the 18th century is still being played and known by many. The always composed British commander Darjeeling accepts their invite for the skirmish. The British team sports
Darjeeling,
one
Orange
Churchill
Pico,
infantry tank, a heavy
Rosehip,
tank produced and used by the
Assam.
British from 1941 to 52, and 4 Matilda II infantry tanks, produced and used by the British from 1938 until 1943, with some seeing service until 1945 in the Pacific. Before the match, the British promised to not fight dirty like Saunders or Pravda, the American and Russian schools. Hey Darjeeling, how's that empire doing? Also, fun fact, the necklaces the judges at this match are shown wearing are called Fieldgemeri, and they are what
I'm like
German
Canadian,
military
so it's
police
like
wore during World War II to
dab
denote
on
their
that
status
British
as enemies.
Empire.
Episode 4 is the first real battle we get to see. The battle opens with the same scene as the flash forward in Episode 1. Ori takes a position on the high ground and begins the match. This is also the next instance of suspending your disbelief that you must go through. To name a few, that Churchill is moving too fast, that Matilda is moving too fast, that Type 89 is moving too fast, that Panzer IV is moving too fast. See a pattern here? The most egregious of these are the British tanks, as the Churchill and Matilda are classified as infantry tanks, meaning they support foot soldiers and as a result are designed to be very slow because there's no point in having it go any faster than a man can walk. The Matilda's top speed cross-country is only rated at 9
No
miles per hour,
T-34
and the
stuck in a
Churchill's is
boulder,
rated at 15.
unrealistic.
In fact, the fastest tank on the whole battlefield is the Panzer 38T at 26.1 miles per hour on road, and all tanks involved look like they're going much faster than that. The 38T and M3 Lee are knocked out, and the remaining 3 Ori tanks retreat to the city, with the British sipping tea as they chase them. One Matilda is taken out along with the
That's
Su
good
3 and Type 89,
tea!
leaving the Panzer IV all alone.
I love more tea, 'cause I'm so bloody British.
Flags, huh? Of course not.
Well, until the 38T comes back.
This
to
is
stop
how
them.
the British people talk, don't you know?
Then the Panzer IV begins to defy all logic and physics in trying to win the match. You can't drift a tank. But the British still end up winning. This battle is one of the more outrageous
Sure.
ones, especially with the Panzer
Sure
IV's
can
antics
drift
at
a
the
tank,
end,
but not with
the
that
accelerated speed
attitude.
remains a constant throughout the series. After this, some storyline exposition about the characters happens that nobody cares about, but the episode ends with the starting positions for the tournament being selected, with Ori being paired up against Saunders, or the Americans.
America! Expletive, yeah!
This video is getting long. Episode 5 begins with Miho and the gang eating at a tank-themed shop named the Leclerc Tank Cafe, a reference to the AMX Leclerc main battle tank currently used by the French Armed Forces. And there are a few references inside, including a poster with the cover art of the 1993 manga Happy Tiger, featuring a Tiger 1, and a heavy transport vehicle used to deliver the food. There's then a strategy talk and some exposition, and these guys show up to drop some basic villain lines.
Oh, hey, Miho. I see you managed to stay sober until the afternoon. Congratulations.
Oh, it's Maho and Bitch Pants McFuckwit. Still have those experiences?
There's also a poster of a T-34 and a poster of a tortoise on the wall
Bitch
back
pants
there.
McFuckwits.
Embarrassing if one of those teams beat the veterans that all sat around in their ivory towers coming up with that rule.
The girls then head back to school on a Kasuga
Dropping some
class
heat!
The next day, the girls go to Yukuri's house looking for her after she wasn't in school. And inside her room, there is a treasure trove of World War II references. In fact, instead of listing them all off, I'm going to label them on the screen as they come up because there are literally that many. Also, Yukuri is my spirit animal.
She's so completely into tanks that she can't really find friends that understand her.
After a while, Yukuri returns and reveals that she's been spying on the school they're up against first in the tournament. She plays them a video she took while there, and in it she spots the team's vehicles, which consist almost entirely of N4 Shermans and their variants. The Sherman was an American-made tank developed in 1940 and saw service in the US, British, and Soviet armies throughout World War II, and in many other conflicts under many other flags after that. The variants spotted are the M4A1, which sported the larger T-23 turret and a new 76mm gun, and the M4A6, a rare variant with only 75 built, featuring a multi-fuel engine and a part-cast, part-welded hull design. Also, a lot of the tanks are shown equipped with sand skirts, which is something the Americans were not fond of and did not use much during the war. At the American school meeting, there's
Sherman
a
is the
historical
Todd
area.
Howard of
In the order
tanks,
of
it
battle,
just
the girl
works.
announcing mentions them using
Well, I mean, every nation
was a
have
real
their,
tank
like,
that was
workhorse
based off the
tank,
Sherman
and
series, but it was a conversion made using
I feel like the Sherman is probably the
the
most
U.S. Army never used it, and it doesn't
underrated
make any sense
tank
having it on the American
of
team.
World War
The
II,
last
because
reference
everybody's
in the
like,
cutaway is
oh
when
yeah,
Clarice
those
finds out and asks
American
for her
tanks.
class and
It's like,
grade, she responds,
they did a good job.
a reference to Donald Sutherland's character in the movie Kelly's Heroes, where he plays a tank commander. Yukari then books it out of there, and back in the present day, they discuss strategy.
Jeez, how'd you get out of there?
Oh my god, get down! She's got a gun!
Also, Yukari's my spirit animal.
Yukari, murdered in
The next
assembly.
day, the crews practice and receive uniforms.
This
for
show's
the match.
dark, man.
After this, we get to formally meet the American team, Saunders High. The
It was ugly,
stereotypes
though.
for
The
this school are
T-34
pretty
was
much what you'd
pretty,
expect.
and the
They're
Germans
filthy
used a bunch
rich
of different
and have a
tanks.
ton of everything. The most tanks, the largest ship, and a million food trucks. They're also loud and obnoxious and very full of themselves, even bringing cheerleaders to their match.
Hey there, Anna. It's been a while. I see you're still legally dwarf, Ken.
This is the first match of the series with a flag tank that, if taken out by the enemy team,
Well, like,
causes an automatic loss.
the
for that team.
T-34 was such a
And the
weird
rest of the matches
anomaly
in the series are set
because
up this way.
it just
After some dialogue,
ticked
the match
off so
starts.
many boxes for what it needed to do,
It mostly
and
consists of the
was
Americans
easy to
rushing the Ori
produce,
team
easy
and
to
the Ori team running
maintain.
away. There's also this
Um,
scene.
Say, do you know this old joke? The American president used to show
yeah,
off
I don't know
how
if you can like really typify Russian design, but it reminds me sort of like that AK-47 perfect storm of
Does that
just
include the hotline to hell?
something very efficient, very
That I thought was
rugged,
going to be
and
another niche
it's not the
historical
most
reference, but I
accurate,
can't
it's
for
not
the
the
life of me figure out
greatest
what the
of
hell
at what
she was
it does,
talking
but
about.
it just works
From
so
what I can gather, it's some
consistently that
kind
that
of statement on the Americans
consistency
cheating.
is
Yes,
what's
of course, the
gonna
Americans cheat. And this is revealed a few
make it
scenes later when they
dependable in the
begin
long
listening to
run.
Ori's radios.
Isn't that illegal? What did you just say to me? I'm pretty sure this
But it also, people stereotype it, and it's like Russia genuinely had like major advances in what they were doing in World War
Miho
II.
soon figures this out,
They
though,
were
and begins
ahead
giving
of
fake
like
orders over
many,
the
many
radio and
other
texting real
countries
ones via
in
Sayori.
several things
They
that they
then
were
later
doing,
load two
and
Shermans out into the open,
you
where
know,
one is destroyed by the Stug 3.
people undersell them as like these crazy human wave tactic madmen, and they weren't like that at all. Like, they had strategic operation, they had doctrine, they just... It's sort of the
This episode
nature
begins
of
with the crowd in
any
shock that the
offensive
Americans
when
lost a
you're,
tank,
like,
and Miho continuing to give false orders over the radio.
by comparison, you
Mental
see the
breakdown, though,
Germans
begins to
take
get
most of
cocky,
their
and half their team
casualties
begin to
when
walk
they
into
were
a
on the
trap.
offensive invading
Type
the
89
Soviet
runs into
Union,
the enemy
so the
flag
Soviet
tank, and they have an
Union
awkward
takes most
moment.
of their
I feel
casualties
like
in
I've seen this
response
before.
to countering the Germans and coming back.
Also, once again, the Type 89 is an infantry tank with a top speed of 16 miles an hour, and the Sherman has a top speed of 30 miles an hour, so this shouldn't even be a chase. But thou must do what thine script commands. Also, the script becomes self-aware for a second.
What are you doing? They're only a Type 89, you know?
But the chase leads to the American flag tank being ambushed, and the Ori team chases it with the Americans chasing them. As this girl loses it, spouting Americanisms as she goes.
Our school is on a different level than yours! Who the hell do those girls think they are? They can't do squat and they're trying to come after us! Their school's getting shut down soon anyway!
Then there's an hour of chase scene with the Type 89 and M3 Lee being taken out until the Panzer IV gets to higher ground
Americans. I have the high ground.
and kills the American tank right as the Firefly kills the Panzer IV, winning Ori the match.
I don't think that's really the case at all, that Americans were massacred in every battle unless they used artillery.
And once again, that 17-pounder shot should have liquefied the Panzer IV crew, but this sport is safe somehow.
For God's sakes, Miho, get in the tank!
God damn it!
Then there's some plot and a few characters fly off in a German FA-233 Drache, a dual-rotor helicopter developed in 1940 and produced in extremely limited numbers. But a combination of unreliability and its factories being bombed caused it to have a virtually non-existent service life. But I'm willing to bet we paperclipped whoever developed it. Close the episode, we are shown a clip of the next team against Ori in the tournament, Pravda, or the Russians, moments after their victory over the Polish team. With several
More like
T-34s
best
overlooking a burned-out
tank
twin
school.
turret 7TP tank. The 7TP, or 7-ton, was a light tank produced by Poland from 1935 to 39, and saw action during the German-Soviet invasion of Poland.
Poland
in
actually had some
1939,
really good
with some
ideas
seeing
for
service
tanks
in
that,
German occupation
like,
divisions throughout
would
the
have
war.
genuinely
And there
been
was also a single turret
forward-thinking
variant made with an anti-tank gun
if
sight.
they
And
hadn't
right after
been
this, there's a
destroyed
brief
so
clip
early
of
in
the
the
German
war.
team leader in a Tiger 1 overlooking a field of destroyed Type 95 Ha-Go tanks from the defeated Japanese school. And if you look closely, you can also see a Type 45 C-Low and a Type 99 Rut-Row.
Rut-Row. I guess we gotta watch part 2 now, don't we?
I wanted to skip this one, but there's some tank stuff in it, so I couldn't do it. But the first half is all plot. You do, though, get the backstory of why Miho was being so cringy about tankery. At the last tournament she was in at her old school, she lost her team the match because she went to help some people not drown, and her family disowned her for it. I personally think, in a sport that's supposedly safe as tankery, that if you see someone in real danger, you'd be commended to go help them, but apparently that doesn't apply. You need to be in the way of shells that aren't going to hurt you. But in the flashback, the number on the turret of the Tiger tank she is in is 217, which is the turret number of tank ace Otto Carius, who was a Tiger tank commander in World War II. Then there's another 20 minutes of plot and practicing until the team goes looking for more tanks to beef up their numbers, and in the process they kind of explain the school aircraft carriers.
Why are we on a ship? To produce highly trained individuals capable of excelling in any field.
Miho and Hana find a 75mm KWK-40 L-43 high-velocity cannon for the Panzer IV that will upgrade it from a D
Long answer. Why are we on a ship? Because it's cool, okay? Because it's cooler if we're on a ship.
The Panzer IV from an infantry support role to an anti-tank role to take on the heavier Soviet vehicles. The History Club and Yukuri then find a French Char B tank in the river. Used by the French from 1936 to 1940,
Char
this
B.
tank made its name during the battle for France in 1940, and being a very difficult obstacle for the German panzers to deal with. It did have some large shortcomings, namely its abysmal speed of 24 kilometers an hour, or 17 miles an hour, which was not suited for countering a war of movement that the Germans were waging. And the sign next to it when it is found may be a reference to that.
Maximum of 60mm of armor, 75mm and 47mm guns. Guess it's better than the Type 89.
Also, Yukuri's my spirit animal.
That's the way to go, Montgomery.
Say, isn't that a little...
How about Guderian then?
They then journey into the ship to find the lost freshman team using a compass in an enclosed metal space, somehow. What? What the fuck? And in the process find a Porsche Tiger, but more on that later. The episode closes with them completely skipping over the match against the Italians, because the Italians are never going to live down their World War II performance and is remembered only to be a meme in history. But they show a few of their tanks.
Mamma mia, we lost the tank battle! Oh, pasta, pasta!
This episode begins with Katusha, the leader of the Russian team, meeting with
I don't
Darjeeling, which may be a
appreciate
reference to
you
Stalin and
using the
Churchill meeting in
stereotype.
Moscow in 1942 to discuss the war. At this, Darjeeling spouts some more deep bullshit while Mini Stalin acts as Russian as she possibly can.
You go to Gulag.
The Nutcracker Suite by Tchaikovsky plays in the background. The Panzer IV is shown to have been upgraded.
We mentioned we are Russian. We love Russian things.
This tank, though, is also understaffed, with a crew of 4 and only having 3, with a commander who also works as the loader and gunner for the 37mm in the turret, a loader for the 75mm in the hull, a driver who also aims and fires the 75mm in the hull, and a radio operator. On the Girls in Panzer wiki, they explained this by saying the commander also works the radio, and although the radio position on the Char B was right under the commander, the French added this extra man because the commander could not be expected to spend a lot of his time crouched on the floor when he was supposed to command the tank. French tank design is very strange. Later, the student council meets with Miho and says this.
We've passed a latitude of 50 degrees north.
The 50th parallel is about where Russia starts on the map of the globe. You then see Miho plan for the match, where you hear her say,
Prof is pretty good on the counterattack after all.
referencing the slew of successful counterattacks pulled off by the Red Army during the war. We then see Orai right before the match, where Miho mentions putting Winterkitten on their tank. These were track extensions put on Panzer III's and IV's tracks in the winter in Russia to help with traction in the snow, and were used widely on the Eastern Front. You then formally meet the Russian team. Their name Pravda is a reference to the official
Team.
newspaper of the Soviet Communist Party published throughout the USSR, and their leader's name Katusha is a reference to a Soviet marching song from the time of the war. Katusha herself arrives in a truck armed with launchers for Katusha rockets, which were used to strike terror into German soldiers. I mean, just listen to them. Fuck that. We then get our first look at Pravda's tanks, including an IS-2, the Soviets' answer to the big cats that the Germans were producing, that when developed mid-war was a huge
like,
shock
I
to
feel
the
like...
Wehrmacht when it debuted in 1944.
I don't know if it's
Second, we see a
overrated or
KV-2,
underrated,
a
but
tank meant
the
to be an effective
Katusha
weapon to destroy concrete
trucks
emplacements,
were
but saw
a
success
really
against
important
German
part of
panzers
World
during
War
the initial
II
invasion
that
of Russia in 1941.
you never really
Seriously,
see
go
much
look up
of.
the battles the KV-2s were in. They're insane and what Wikipedia was meant for. I also made my own video on the KV-2 if you want to check it out. The rest of the team is composed of T-34s, which were the backbone of the Russian armored force in World War II. You see both T-34-76s, which were early war models, and T-34-85s, which were a mid-war upgrade that increased the turret size for a bigger cannon, and another crew member so the commander could focus on commanding the tank and not do double duty. They then charged to an... and the show's rendition of the song Katusha, the aforementioned Russian marching song. Ori decides to attack head-on, and it goes about as well as expected, with the Sharbi having some trouble in what I imagine is a reference to its slow speed. There's also a Stalingrad reference, because it's required when you have a battle in the snow. After taking out a couple T-34s, Ori is surrounded
Stalingrad? More like Stalinglad.
and Ori retreats into a church with the Panzer IV bouncing shells that it probably shouldn't bounce. Katusha then asks for surrender under a white flag, and Monocle Girl quotes General McAuliffe at Bastogne.
Please surrender.
Got him!
But everybody's pretty bummed out about it. But then the student council informs everybody
These
the school will be shut down if they lose the tournament, and everyone is even more bummed out. But you'll never guess who wins. Oh my god, maybe it's the main characters, I don't know. After a plot flashback, we see everyone is stuck in the church under the Russian siege, freezing. Very direct. Miho rallies everyone with a rousing speech, and they begin to plan their breakout. Katusha is seen sleeping in a Soviet RF-8 fan-driven snowmobile, as Nona sings the Cossack lullaby to her. The RF-8 was developed in 1942 and was often used in reconnaissance activities for the Red
The
Army.
swaggity swooty scooter shooter.
Miho sends cosplay girl Yukuri to do recon, and we are treated to this.
Marching in the snow and treading the ice. We can't tell what was a river or what was a road. The horse collapses, but we can't leave it behind. Everywhere we go, we're in the midst of the enemy.
Now, what they're trying to sing sounds like this. Now, I guess this doesn't translate very well, but I would think you could at least, like, have the two of their voices sync up or something. I don't see why they took take one and were just like, yeah, that'll do. Anyways, this
I mean,
song
it's just nerds that are
translates
in
to
the
Snowy
tanks
March,
that are gonna
is a
watch
Japanese
this.
marching
It's not a
song
big
recounting
deal.
the veterans' feelings after the battle of, I'm not even going to try to pronounce that, between the Japanese Empire and the Chinese Empire in the First Sino-Japanese War. Also, Mako and one of the Helmet Girls do some recon to spot tanks, and this is said.
It's a Stalin, too.
A JS2.
Now, I always call this tank an IS-2, but it all comes down on how you pronounce Stalin's name. If you pronounce it like this, it's a JS2. But if you pronounce it like this, which is closer to the Russian pronunciation, it's an IS-2. Neither are wrong, but I see people get into arguments over this all the time. Everyone gets back, and
I
there are more
still
Stalin
feel like it should be IS-2, because, I mean, everything else you keep the same name for, T-34. Like, you don't change it and call it an M-34.
Also, the History Club references the Hakoda Mountains incident, where in 1902, 193 men of the Imperial Japanese Army froze to death on an excursion, and it has since been observed as one of the worst mountaineering disasters in human history.
Ooh.
Miho rallies the team with some cringe, and the plot armor covers it. If only Paulus had plot armor. Ori charges at Pravda, destroying a few T-34s in the process, provoking a chase. And the 38T goes ham before being knocked out. After things settle down, Yukuri runs into a tower and finds the enemy flag tank that quickly runs off. The M3 Lee is knocked out as Ori runs into and kills the KV-2. The Sharbi is killed, and after some chase, the Pravda
Take
flag
that,
tank is destroyed, winning Ori the
KV-2.
match. Pravda is out, and mini Stalin loses her composure faster than real Stalin when the Germans came knocking. Also, I would count a tank's track being shot out as a knockout in this sport. The student council plans for the next match, and decides to look for more tanks. We then see the Automotive Club has repaired the previously found Porsche Tiger, which in reality was the competing design to Henschel's that later went into production. It had a list of failings and was really a very poor tank, and the show references this. If you want to know more about the Porsche Tiger, I actually did a full video on it. Check it out in the link.
More like the poor
my spirit
Tiger.
Call the tank, doesn't it? It might have a bad belt system design, but its 88mm cannon is really powerful.
The various teams then go looking for more tanks. The student council upgrades their 38T into a Hetzer.
Bruh, you simping a Tiger tank?
Simple. Despite the appearance, the Hetzer was not simply built on the existing 38T chassis design. It simply took advantage of the parts already being manufactured for the already existing medium tank. The Hetzer was wider, had a modified suspension, and an upgraded engine, just to name a few changes. Also, there is little to no evidence the name Hetzer was actually used by German crews, and is most likely a post-war name. The Germans just called it a Jagdpanzer 38T. With the modification, though, the student council team is still understaffed, still needing a loader. They also add side armor skirting to the Panzer IV hull and turret called Schürzen, which technically upgrades it to an H model. Although in the production runs for Panzer IV H's, there were various other changes made, such as the deletion of the side hull vision ports to ease production. The team then finds a Japanese Type 3 Chai Nu to add to the team. The Type 3 was an upgraded version of the Type 97 Chai Ha, incorporating a long 75mm gun and a larger turret ring, making it one of the largest tanks the Japanese built. But as with most Japanese tanks developed late in the war, it was retained for the defense of the home islands and never saw service. It's decided the Automotive Club will crew the Porsche Tiger, and that leaves this tank understaffed as well, with 4 crew needing 5.
I mean, Automotive,
commander,
Porsche.
Loader, gunner, driver, and radio operator. A new team is recruited for the Type 3, made up of 3 people who met online playing a tank game. What could that possibly be? This team creates the most understaffed tank crew so far, though, with 3 members needing 5. A commander, loader, gunner, driver, and radio operator. And if you're wondering the reason I harp on this, it's because the tanks from all the other schools are always seen being crewed to capacity. So this seems like a strange deliberate action to take away from the very spot-on historical accuracy of all the visuals in the show. Anyways, then there's some plot. The night before the match, all the teams hang out together. In the dub, you are treated to this gym,
We'll win!
and the freshman team is seen as heroes, with recreated scene for scene. The next day, the teams arrive for the finals, and there's a full-blown tank convention going on. I would cover the references, but there are many, and I've covered a lot of them in the past. The British, Americans, and Russians come by to wish Orai good luck, with Mini Stalin telling Miho to
Crush Koromori Mine like Operation Bagration did.
Operation Bagration was a Soviet offensive launched on June 22nd, 1944 that utterly destroyed the German Army Group Center.
I kind of wish they'd given Katyusha, like, a really cheesy Russian accent. That would have been more fun. Crush them, like in Operation Bagration.
Attack us all at once the second the match starts.
Which pretty much describes World War II in a nutshell, with a front-loaded German offensive.
I always feel like I can
gets
speak
bogged
deeper
down
if I
into
speak
attritional war
Russian.
they can't win. The German team features mostly mid to late war tanks, and holy fuck, there's a lot of them, so strap in. First you see a Jagdpanzer IV. This tank destroyer, developed in 1943 and based on the chassis of a Panzer IV, mounted the same 75mm.
Yeah, every time someone starts talking about, like, the best tanks German had in the world, the best tanks that Germany had in World War II, they were all things that were, like, in production in 1944, barely saw combat.
Early in its production run, but as the war drug on, various improvements were made that eventually earned it the title of one of the best tanks of the war, with good armor and the aforementioned deadly gun. Next, a Jagdpanther, the tank destroyer variant of the Panther, mounting the 88mm L-70 gun of the Tiger II. Although used to great success, very few of these were built as well due to late war production problems. Next is the Germans' final fielded submission to the heavy tank competition with the Soviets, the Tiger II. First fielded in 1944, this tank, meant to be Hitler's wonder weapon, had a less than stellar performance in the field due to an underpowered engine and transmission. Then, a Jagdtiger. The Tiger II's tank destroyer variant armed with a massive 128mm PaK-44 L-55 gun. This is also the heaviest vehicle fielded in the war, weighing in at nearly 72 tons. It, though, was also plunged with mechanical problems and made little impact as it debuted so late in the war, being fielded even after the Tiger II. Then there is a Ferdinand tank destroyer, the thing the Porsche Tiger later became. And for more than you want to know about this vehicle, check out the link below. Lastly, there is a Tiger I. This German heavy tank debuted in 1942 and was a direct response to the heavy
More like the
tanks that
Tiger
Germans ran into in
lost.
France and Russia.
Get it? Because
It has since
Tiger
become the
won,
poster child
Tiger
for German
lost.
tanks of World War II due
Ha
to
ha
its
ha.
deadly reputation.
Pun jokes.
Also, this Tiger has the number 212 on its turret, which is the turret number for German tank ace Michael Wittmann. The
More
Germans
like
attacked
German
quickly through
tank
the forest, planting this
ass.
line,
They used the forest as a shortcut?
which is a reference to the German invasion of France, where the German army sidestepped the Maginot Line, attacking through the Ardennes.
No! You can't just go around the Maginot Line and invade through the Ardennes? Panzer tank go
The
brrrr.
episode ends with a cliffhanger.
A lift clanger.
With the Type 3 out, Ori retreats looking for a better position while releasing smoke to mask their movements. Eventually taking a position on
I'll
hill,
have a
the
number
Germans fall back.
9.
The Hetzer immobilizes the Jagdpanther and a Panther, but this does little to stop the attack. The Germans charge up the hill, and a few vehicles do better with the incline
Up
than they
the
should.
hill.
Namely the Ferdinand, or Elephant, as this example is a late war refit model, and the Jagdtiger. Both had very underpowered drivetrains for their weight, which should give them a
Now
lot of trouble with
I want to play a tank game, but I don't know if I should play War Thunder or if I should play World of Tanks.
Fires, and they became overstressed ascending a hill to get to a firing position.
Like, I know deep
The
down War
Jagdtigers were being
Thunder is the
lost
better
left and right
tank
at the end
game,
of the
but
war
more
due to
people play
transmission
World of
overstressing
Tanks.
issues. So this seems kind of a
Uh,
stretch. The Hetzer bullies the Jagdpanther again.
Hooray. Tracks.
And after a volley and some distraction by the Hetzer, Ori charges down the hill. Darjeeling says this,
They started using heavy tanks against Pravda, but it worked against them here.
which is a reference to the heavy tank arms race between the Soviet Union and Germany in World War II that ended up producing many of the tanks we see Kuromori Mine use in the show. The Tiger II throws a track, giving Ori time to redeploy. Then there's a river crossing scene that's too long. Yakuri is seen spotting using an EM-R36 rangefinder, a German stereoscopic rangefinder from World War II. Ori crosses a bridge and heads towards the city where it encounters a Panzer III, but the Panzer III leads them into the German team's mouse tank.
Damn, boy. Damn, boy, he's thick.
He's thick! That's a thick boy!
The mouse was supposed to be the next step in the German heavy tank program, weighing 188 tons, crowning it the title of the world's largest super heavy tank, and packing the same gun as the Jagd
Chonker tank.
with an additional coaxial 75mm cannon.
Probably
This thing
gonna
was meant to
end
be
the
a
stream
bunker on
after this
tracks, impervious
video.
to all anti-tank guns it came across. However, this thing was little more than a pipe dream with only 2 prototypes built that never saw service.
Or actually, I
If it
might
did
change it
somehow
up
manage to
and,
see service, though, I think it would have just made
I'm
nice
gonna end
target
it.
practice for Sturmovik
I need to have a
pilots,
bite to
as
eat,
the
and then
thing
I'll
was
come back
incredibly
and play
impractical
some
and
tank
slow.
games.
In the perfect world of the show, though, it is quite the force to be reckoned with. The Char B attempts to kill it and is promptly destroyed.
What a fool you are. I'm a god. How can you kill a god?
Morrowind.
The Stug is also killed as Ori retreats to the Germans advancing to the Panzer lead.
That fluttery hair.
Premium tier plot armor allows the mouse to be taken out, even though Ori probably could have just outrun and ignored it, and the German team makes it into the city. The Hetzer dies from damage, and the lead takes out the elephant with a shot to the rear. And this was kind of foreshadowed with the scene from Kelly's Heroes that the freshmen were watching in the previous episode. The Jagdtiger takes out the Lee right before falling into a ditch, and the Porsche Tiger blocks off the route for most of the German team to get to Miho, leaving one enemy Tiger in the Panzer IV, both of which are flag tanks, to duel it out one-on-one. The Porsche Tiger bounces a lot of shells that it probably wouldn't, especially at that range, before eventually being taken out. But it buys Miho enough time to have a Need for Speed style chase with the enemy Tiger,
Deja
and
vu!
eventually taking it out, winning Ori the match, even though the Ori flag tank was once again immobilized. Everyone celebrates, there's some plot, and the show ends with a parade.
So basically, German tanks are the best, and
This
if you
part is
don't
just
think
my
so,
thoughts on the show,
then
so feel free to click away.
yeah.
Although the plot is predictable, the characters are kind of dumb at times, and I'm not an anime fan, I am extremely impressed at the historical detail put into this show.
But it's important to remember, like, a lot of the details that we consider
even in that strange
fact
live
for
action
German
film.
tanks
But in all the other aspects
is
of the show, there are a bunch of
kind
things
of brought
that
to
didn't cover in
us
the show, such
by
as each little
German
aircraft carrier
tankers.
representing a real
So
Ori being based on
when
a
we
real
were
town
writing the
large
books
Japan,
for it and
and
looking for
various
information on it, a
historical
lot of
references made by the
times
History Club
they
that are
just
so
assumed,
numerous
oh,
and
well, they
couldn't
were
be big
there,
ones
so they know
because
better.
there was so
But
much
we've come to
packed into
learn
the show
now
itself.
they
This show was
installed a
clearly made
lot of
by
their own
history fans
biases
for
into their
history
books,
fans. And it's honestly
and
pretty awesome.
would
I mean, the man himself
regularly,
worked on
you
it,
know,
so
kind of
what would you
favor their
expect?
own
But
stuff a little
seriously, even
more
if you dislike anime
because,
like I do, I
you know,
would
you
implore
don't
you to
kind of
watch the
shoot your
series,
own,
even the movie.
you don't
Also, if I
shoot
can
your
get
own
all gay for a
soldiers,
second, I'm
right?
at a
So they
loss
didn't
for
want
words
to,
for
you
all the
know,
support I've been
say
getting.
that the guys
When I
back
started
home
this
were
channel
making
and this
tanks for
series,
nothing.
I honestly didn't think it would go anywhere, and the response has been overwhelming. So thank you so much, and I promise I will continue to try to make videos you will
Honk.
like.
Alright, well, everyone have a great day, and I will be back later.
That's unfortunately about as high up as it goes. Good evening!
So yeah, I'm going, bye-bye.